The car has been king of the road for so long that it probably seems like 'twas ever thus. But of course, it hasn't been. In fact, Ontario began regulating automobile use of the roads just over 100 years ago. So how did it come to be that most of us think roads are first and foremost for cars? Peter Norton teaches the history of technology at the University of Virginia and is author of Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City. And he joins us now from Charlottesville, Virginia, with some historical perspective. Peter, it's good to see you. How are you tonight?
Good to be here, Steve. I'm happy to be with you.
Excellent. I'm sure most people are familiar with the story of Henry Ford and how he mass-produced the first automobiles in North America. But my question is, how readily and quickly did North Americans actually embrace the car to begin with?
Well, it depends on the North Americans that you're talking about. So, in particular, there's a big distinction between the rural North American and the city dweller. And people who lived in cities took to automobiles in North America a lot more slowly. Henry Ford himself thought of the automobile primarily as a way to get the farmer out of the mud, to connect the farmer to the market. But once you're in town, people had plenty of other ways to get around, and in ways that didn't require them to park their car anywhere, ways that were inexpensive and convenient already. So it took a real change of mindset for people to think of the car as something for city dwellers as well as for the rural person.
Was it a case of they just didn't cotton onto it quickly enough, or was it more like outright hostility?
There was real hostility, and I think this is the part of our history that we don't remember very well. In part because, frankly, our history was mostly written for us by people who wanted to have lots of automobiles in cities, and they made sure that the version of history that we inherited and grew up with did not include the extent of the hostility to the automobile that there really was in the city. People were very angry about them. They thought of them as invading the city.
We've got an editorial cartoon from the New York Times from 1924 that we took out of your book. What was the sentiment towards cars in the mainstream press at the time?
The mainstream press was amazingly hostile to automobiles in cities. I'm talking about conventional newspapers, the leading dailies of their respective cities were typically quite hostile to cars. You could see that in their editorial pages in particular. You could see it in the editorials that were in text form. You could see it in the cartoons like this one. And you could see it also in the letters to the editors. So of course, newspapers depend on their readers to subscribe, and newspapers were reflecting the fact that in cities, a lot of the readers were very upset that cars were taking over streets. Letters to the editor were often overwhelmingly hostile to automobiles. The writers of these letters thought of them as invading the space that had been for pedestrians, for streetcars. And they thought of them also as dangerous, in particular dangerous to pedestrians and above all to children.
When did that change?
Well, the change was over a period of years. It was quite spectacular in terms of the drama entailed in it, real conflict, real pushback between opposing groups. And in particular, people who wanted a future for automobiles in cities undertook to redefine what streets are for. I mean, they put it that way themselves. They said we have to, and I'm quoting now, we need a radical revision in our conception of what a city street is for. They viewed that as the only way they could sell cars in cities without having all the bad press that they were attracting, thanks to all this. And the period when this happened primarily was in the 1920s.
1920 still, okay, because it's interesting, nearly 100 years later, some of those expressions would still be quite comfortably used today. Let me go on to talk about something that I suspect we've all done at one time or another, even though we shouldn't fess up to it. Jaywalking. Where did that come from?
Well, jaywalking is what we now call what streets were always for up until the 20th century and into the 20th century. Jaywalking means walking in the street, but not in the crosswalk and not with the green light. Now, when automobiles started to become common in city streets, when people were walking where they wanted, that meant that sometimes cars hit pedestrians. And in the early years, everybody, I'm talking about the judges, the juries, the police, the newspapers, the letters to the editor, authors, everybody blamed the car and the driver. And shifting that blame to the pedestrian took some very inventive and very intensive public relations campaigns. One big piece of these public relations campaigns was to use a term of ridicule, jay, which meant like an ignorant rural person, like a hick, and attach that to the word walker with the signification that if you're walking around in the city street, you don't know how to live in the city, or you're some sort of ignoramus. And so there were intensive public relations campaigns to get this word out there. The word was controversial. The New York Times ran an editorial condemning the use of this word as much too insulting to ever be used by anybody in official life, at least. But through some very inventive and relentless public relations campaigns, the people who wanted a future for cars in cities were able to get that word into circulation. And by about 1930, most people accepted this term for the pedestrian who was unwilling to cross at the crosswalk.
I gather the Boy Scouts had a role in all of this as well?
Yes, they did. So when I say the campaign was inventive, one of the inventive techniques was to find a lot of free labor in the form of Boy Scouts. This was done all over North America. Auto clubs, auto dealers, usually the local automotive interest groups, would recruit Boy Scouts to do volunteer work for them. These Boy Scouts would hand out little cards that said something like, "Did you know you are jaywalking?" It would define the term for people because people did not know what it meant in, say, 1920. And it would sort of lecture the pedestrian on how to cross the street in the motor age. Now, a lot of pedestrians resented this. I know of one pedestrian couple who deliberately collected as many of these cards as they could by deliberately crossing anywhere but in the crosswalk. But with time, this got the word into general circulation. By 1924, the word was in a dictionary of American English.
Now, those automobile clubs that you just referenced, what else did they do in order to try to change the sentiment around cars?
Well, there was a lot of inventive strategies. In particular, besides the jaywalking campaign, they realized that they could best influence the future by reaching children. And by 1928 in the U.S., the #1 supplier of safety education materials in the classrooms of the public schools of the country was the American Automobile Association. They supplied these materials, curricula, for free to the public schools, and the materials instructed children in how to be safe on streets. And the message was a new one. The message was, you know, the street is for autos. This is their term. There's a page of a coloring book, for example, where children, while coloring in a picture of traffic in a street, were constantly looking at the sentence, "The street is for autos." They also sponsored school safety patrols, which already existed. The school safety patrols before the automobile club sponsorships would go in and stop traffic, but increasingly the auto club sponsored groups would direct the children to stay on the sidewalk until there was no traffic. And this was a real trend toward children losing access to the street. Probably for the best, because by then it was too dangerous to be in the street. But this is all part of that redefinition of what streets are for.
Now, did pedestrians try to, that you can discern at all, fight back at the time against this trend?
They most certainly did. The most visible sign of this resistance by pedestrians is in the letters to editors, where there's real anger and resentment expressed about this. And to be fair to those pedestrians, they did have the law on their side in the early years. So Canada and the U.S. are both inheritors of the common law tradition, and under the common law tradition, the street is a public space for all to be used by anyone, provided they don't endanger or obstruct other users. And on that basis, pedestrians had a real priority claim because they don't obstruct very much, they're small, and they don't endanger anybody the way a motor vehicle does. So to change that took superseding that inherited common law tradition with some statutory law in the form of city traffic ordinances. which in the US were written up by Motordom themselves and then promoted to the state legislatures and the local governments for a sort of off-the-shelf plug-in. By the mid-1920s, these were proliferating in US cities in particular, and later in Canadian cities as well. And these traffic ordinances are the ones we are all familiar with. We grew up with them. They're the ones that give priority to automobiles, to motor vehicles, and they're the ones that sort of turn pedestrians into resident aliens in their own street. They sort of have to petition for access to the street by pressing a little button for a crosswalk signal.
Oh, yeah, well, we're all familiar with that. Peter,
Right.
let's finish up on this because you know the expression, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So much of what's in your book about the way things were and the kinds of arguments advanced, I mean, we hear these all 100 years later, right? I mean, so
Yes.
little that seems to have changed on this front. Is that fair to say?
I think it's very fair to say. I think history has momentum, and that momentum is favoring the status quo, which gives automobiles priority in the streets. And if we remembered the fact that there was a radical revolution in favor of the automobile, and actually history is on the side of the pedestrian and the cyclist, then I think we'll be in a better position to reimagine our streets in ways that might actually be healthier, more environmentally friendly, more people friendly, more spatially efficient, better for all.
What a novel idea that is. Peter Norton from the University of Virginia, it's really good of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Thank you.
My pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.